Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello, my name is Professor Kieran McEvoy. I work half-time in the School of Law here in Queen's and half-time in the Mitchell Institute. The Mitchell Institute is an interdisciplinary centre for the study of conflict and conflict transition. Today I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Hearty, who works in the law school. Kevin, will you tell us a little bit more about your own PhD research, the debate on policing and the police here in Northern Ireland, particularly within the Republican community?
Well, the PhD was interdisciplinary research that overlapped between memory studies, transitional justice and critical criminology. So there was quite a good breadth of theory and concepts there. But in terms of the empirical case study, it was more a look at how memory conditioned change in Irish Republican views on policing historically and contemporary on the island of Ireland. So we would have looked at sort of what the Republican discourse and attitude to policing was prior to the partition of the island of Ireland. So their relationship with the RIC, their relationship with militias, how that changed upon the foundation of the Northern Ireland state, and their relationship to the Northern Ireland state, but also to the police force tasked with policing the Northern Ireland state. And then how that changed sort of as we entered the era of civil rights, how policing fed into that, how grievances over policing mirrored grievances over civil rights, and then how that sort of changed once conflict broke out and policing undertook a counterinsurgency remit, and how changes in the conflict led to subtle changes in the policing practices and the policing function, and how the Republican relationship with an attitude towards policing changed throughout the conflict to mirror these, and then culminating, I guess, in how Republican attitudes towards policing changed or not as the Patton process came into being, so the Patton process of reform, and then looking at what their attitude was to post-reform policing, so their attitude to, for example, symbolic changes like the change in uniform, the change in name, the change in symbolism, which probably necessary, but were very much dismissed even by those Republicans who have accepted policing as a cosmetic change, and then getting into more substantive sort of changes that would touch on transitional justice stuff like institutional reform as a guarantee of non-recurrence. So looking at the 50-50 recruitment policies, looking at their attitude towards oversight bodies, to the ombudsman, to local policing bodies, and I guess it captured a range of perspectives in all of this from right across the Irish Republican constituency, from those who went to jail for politically motivated actions during the conflict, but who now actually sit on policing bodies, right through to those who belong to political groups that have some sort of loose affiliation with militant spoiler groups, and all of those in between. Because one of the things that kind of, I suppose, surprised me was the actual breadth and different opinions within the broad sort of Republican constituency. So you have people within that who'd be quite left, who would sort of be quite open and say that they'll always oppose policing from a leftist sort of perspective rather than a Republican perspective. So it was quite interesting unpacking all of that and seeing how that fed into wider sort of transitional justice things like approaches to truth recovery, this sort of moving on processes. So you went to jail for 20 years for shooting a police officer. How do you now sit on a local policing board with a police officer? How does a policing officer that you tried to kill feel about you sitting there? So interesting questions like that.
Okay, I think we'll come back to that, Kevin, because I think the Irish experience does have lessons, I suspect, for other jurisdictions. More broadly, where does police reform sit within the broader field of transitional justice?
At initial sort of thought, sometimes it's kind of hard to locate it, and people think, well, transitional justice, what has police reform got to do with that? But whenever you break down, as the TJ scholarship does, sort of the more seminal works on it about these, what the pillars of transitional justice is, it's actually quite easy to seamlessly locate police reform within those pillars. So if you look at Rudy Teitel's work and sort of the earlier transitional justice scholarship that talks about, although we argue in favour of moving beyond legalism, but the early sort of work talks about transitional justice as orientating towards greater respect for the rule of law, particularly within communities that perhaps did not have the rule of law. So you're reforming that and you're trying to build confidence in the rule of law. Naturally, I guess the police force are probably the most physical manifestation of the rule of law that most people are going to encounter in their daily lives. They're not really necessarily going to encounter prison clerks or court clerks or judges, but police officers are by and large quite visible on the ground. So when it comes to increasing confidence in the rule of law, then you have to increase confidence in the police force naturally, because they are tasked with upholding and implementing the rule of law. And quite often, the legitimacy deficit that the state has, where the rule of law wasn't respected, transfers straight over to a legitimacy deficit for the police. So the state isn't seen as legitimate, ergo the police force upholding that state isn't seen as legitimate.
I suppose in a lot of the places we're talking about, Kevin, in transitional justice, the police themselves will have been involved in counterterrorism policing. They will have been the front line in some contexts, often perhaps in partnership with the military in counterterrorism efforts. So they're not normally only involved in ordinary inverted commas policing, but they're involved in policing of conflict, and so that puts them front and center as both a symbol and a practical expression of the state's battle against often what it frames as terrorism. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, no, that would be a fair synopsis. I think if we look at sort of the history of policing before police reform in any society, it normally reflects kind of the undercurrents or the fundamental dynamics of the division within that society that conflict has emerged out of. So you have divided society policing, which is quite often the case in colonial contexts, and indeed here in the north of Ireland, where operates on majority minority groups. So one will take ownership of policing and the criminal justice system, and to a large degree control and ownership of the state, while the minority community is largely excluded. In other contexts, we might have what is seen as regime policing, which would quite often be seen in the southern cone. I suppose would be the more notable examples there, where the police force are really just to protect the political and social order, particularly powerful figures. And then, as you mentioned, in any context where there's political violence, the police force are integral to that conflict, often through counterinsurgency measures. And any police force that's involved in counterinsurgency, it could be the police force in Timbuktu, as much as the RUC here, for example, they all become embroiled in human rights abuses throughout conflict and in counterinsurgency campaigns. And one of the things that sort of often baffles me is how, a lot of these allegations that are now made against what so-called legacy activists, there's nearly a tendency to suggest that the RUC was somehow an aberration to the worldly wide wisdom that any police force engaged in counterinsurgency will abuse human rights. Now, the RUC certainly were not the only police force to do that, but neither were they an exception to that.
Is there an issue here as well? This question comes because I've been recently watching, first of all, Narcos, and then I've also been watching El Chapo, which is about, in effect, how El Chapo Guzman, the drug lord, takes over, becomes a parallel state, essentially, to Mexico. But one of the things that happens in both of those contexts, we're talking there about Colombia and Mexico, is that the police themselves are intrinsically involved, not just in counter-terrorist work, but also in collusion with, in the case of Colombia, collusion with pro-state paramilitary organizations. In the case of Mexico, with drug lords. So you have criminal gangs where different sections of the police local versus national and so forth, specialist squads, where they're lining up with protagonists to the conflict and they're part of the mess. Is that a common experience in the transitional context where the police themselves are part of the mess that is a conflicted or an authoritarian context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're actually great examples. I was doing some reading. Unfortunately, I'm not cool enough to watch interesting shows like that. I'm just a nerd that reads TG academic literature. But I was reading an article by Brian McGonigal-Leigh recently on TJ and police reform, and one of the arguments made there was that one of the ways that policing gets embroiled or enmeshed in the messiness, as you called it, is through corruption.
Mhm.
So quite often in those states like Mexico, not necessarily a conflicted state, but certainly through corruption and involvement with drug cartels. Colombia a little bit more fuzzy there because there was a political conflict, but there is also the dynamics of organized crime there too. But also one of the arguments made in that article was that one of the ways policing can become messy is that not only through human rights abuses and not only through corruption, but also through simply projecting, whether it's the perception or a reality, that they're completely disinterested in providing security to certain sections of the community, or that they're completely disinterested in tackling or completely indifferent to particular elements of crime, be that organized crime or lower level crime. Which, I mean, the parallel justice system, I mean, we've more than enough evidence of that here in the north. As I
Mm.
mean, you've done more research than most people on it. The idea of rough justice, which has sort of evolved, but still
Mhm.
happens.
Yeah, and I think police often see that, understandably, as a threat to their integrity, and so well, and so on one level, the notion that the state should have the monopoly on the use of coercive force rests very heavily with the police. But in another context, if police are if the police, and certainly I think this was the case in the Northern Ireland context, if the police are having to prioritise what kind of crimes they're going to focus on, certainly in the Northern Ireland context during the conflict, they prioritised counterterrorism and ordinary crime, including preventing punishment violence, actually, by paramilitary organisations, was well down the pecking order. So there's a balance being struck there during the conflict. What's your sense, Kevin, of the balances that are struck in the post-conflict process? So if you're engaged in a process of police reform, what kind of balances in that kind of transitional context are being struck?
I think there's several sort of balances. I think the biggest one is that you have to balance the political with the practical. So, there's practical steps you can take, but politically, are they going to be palatable enough for certain constituencies? Because again, just like as we come back at the start about placing police reform within the transitional justice metrics, there's a political context to all of this. There's a political process of transition, and police reform has to be seen in that. So while it might be practical to do something, is the political appetite going to be there for it? I think maybe the best sort of example of that in the northern context would have been the sort of attempt to limit community buy-in in the earlier years of post-reform policing by sort of keeping it top down, and particularly uh, by trying to keep former combatants at an arm's length, and then obviously they were diverted into the likes of Alternative and CRJ, which done amazing work and continue to do amazing work within their communities. But the idea of keeping the former combatants who had the social capital, who had the local knowledge, who had the local links, the local respect, knew their community, the idea of keeping them out, that was probably more a political calculation. If you think would unionist politicians have accepted that in policing, there was still quite a palpable sense of anger within the unionist community over a number of reforms, be that the change in name and symbolism. I think maybe saying to them, you know what, the local provo is also going to be
Mm.
given a chair at the policing table, probably would have been a bit more than they
Tip the
could have
balance
spent.
over, yeah. Yeah, because as you know, in other contexts, for example, in the South African context, former combatants, former members of MK, the military wing of the NC, did in fact join the new policing service in South Africa. I'd be interested in your reflections on this, just to use the Northern Ireland example there. So you're talking about political and practical calculations. And how much of this is bound up with your own particular area around memory? So I remember at one stage talking to a member of the Patent Commission, the body that was established to oversee to write a big report basically under the stewardship of Chris Patten, former governor of Hong Kong, on what needed to happen in terms of policing. And I remember seeing one of the senior members of that talking, and he was talking about the experiences. As you know, one of the things that they did on the commission was they went around different communities hearing about the experiences of policing. And so he said, so whenever they went into Republican areas, the experiences that they heard of policing were of, well, first of all, people didn't know police officers as human beings. As you know, the RUC were predominantly drawn almost exclusively from the unionist community. So they didn't know any human beings who were police officers. But not just that, their experience of policing in Republican areas was about collusion and shoot to kill and torture and human rights abuses and all of those things. And that was their lived experience of policing. And then he said when they went into unionist areas to hear about the experience of policing, for them, the experience of policing was about, first of all, of course, many people would have had family members who were members of the police, but for them, the experience of policing was about bravery and self-sacrifice and professionalism and all of those things. And it was Maurice Hayes, this particular member of the Patent Commission, who was saying this. And his view was both of those experiences were actually true. Both of those experiences reflected reality. So what's your own view as someone who studied very closely the relationship between memory and policing? How does that issue play out, for example, in terms of the broader debate on legacy and policing in Northern Ireland?
I think it's very hard to argue actually with Morris's Hayes' position there. I remember quite a few years ago now writing an article in the British Journal of Criminology that basically said there's the idea of getting a shared narrative of policing is just so pie in the sky that we should actually forget about it. I mean, we would have to build it on such a thin consensus that it would be diluted down to be absolutely meaningless. I think in the book I sort of made an argument that mirrored sort of Hayes' position, and that was that when it comes to memories of policing, we're really engaging in morality plot lines here, where total good versus on one side versus total bad on the other side, and truth. And we've sort of discussed over pints before. Well, you've had a pint and I've had a soda water and lime, strictly after office hours, about the whole notion of truth. And I'm fairly dubious about the whole idea of truth, but you sort of feel that it's good in limiting permissible lies. But what would the permissible lies on the legacy of policing be? I mean, yes, the RUC were indicted by every major human rights organisation on a number of grounds over a number of practices, but over 300 officers also died, over 8,000 were injured. There was an impact on their family life, their daily life, and actually reading their memoirs, you can see, the prevalence of alcoholism actually as a coping mechanism. So, depending on your perspective, I mean, somebody from my sort of communal background and the people where I grew up would certainly not have seen that human element to RUC officers, and certainly wouldn't have seen that impact on their daily lives. But they definitely would have seen the impact of the RUC in their capacity as victimizer. We definitely would have seen the sort of impact that they had on other people's lives. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people from where I grew up, that their narrative of policing is lies, but similarly that doesn't mean that the narrative of the police officer is lies. But I think at the same time too, there is, while we acknowledge there's different perspectives on it, there is still a wholesale denial almost that the RUC ever did anything wrong, and that's sort of spilt over now, and we can see but that's maybe more to do with a wider state issue, and we can see at the moment with Boris trying to pass his overseas bill, trying to give a blank check to informers. I mean, still, there's this notion to do that, you have to buy into some sort of myth that there was nothing ever untoward went on here. But the fact that some RUC officers were involved in collusion, some were involved in shoot to kill, still doesn't detract from the fact that over 300 lost their lives and over 8,000 were injured. So, depending on your perspective, it's both true.
So yeah, I suppose that's exactly why perhaps I'm more in favour of truth recovery processes, is precisely all of those realities, to capture all of those human realities, that experiences of community victimization, but also the lived experiences of police officers and their families, and recognizing that issues around loss, memory, and so forth. It's a very difficult balance to be struck. Obviously, I mean, as you know, in the Patton process, I'll be interested in your views on this. Patton made a conscious in how they were going to manage the transition of policing, in that, unlike other jurisdictions where you knew that you had systemic problems and you knew you had police officers who were involved in illegal activity, human rights abuses, and so forth. So in some contexts, as you're aware, what happens is that you have a process of lustration, in effect, where you, and in some instances even prosecution, where you go after, inverted commas, the bad, and you that's part of the process of creating a new police service. In the Patton process, what they did instead was they privileged human rights at the center of the new policing dispensation. So a privileging of human rights discourse, a privileging of professionalism, of community policing, and they created a very generous pension package. And in effect, what Patton, and I've spoken to commissioners who are very honest about this, what they were trying to do was to say to, particularly if you were of that old school where you thought that human rights abuses or torturing people in police stations was permissible, you should probably take your package. You're not going to like the new protect. What that first of all, do you think that's a reasonable characterization of what Patton did? And secondly, if so, do you think that was the right
Well,
way
yeah,
to
I
go?
think it's exactly what they did. Is the term the Patton golden handshake is part of the parlance in any of the policing literature. Basically, this is a new way of doing things. If you don't like it, here's a huge wad of cash. Take yourself off. In terms of was it right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you look at Argentina, where they did have some sort of token lustration and some sort of token trials, but the people that were involved in the Navy Mechanics School torture centre, quite a lot of those people were able to retain their position, and they were also still in positions of influence and involved in the training of later generations, which might explain why 30 years after the military junta, there were still people being disappeared in Argentina. Like in the 30 years after the military junta, there was 213 people disappeared, 4,000 people shot or tortured by the security services. If you don't remove people that are involved in that, don't be surprised that the same thing happens. In terms of Patton, I mean, it comes back to the political and the practical. What are you going to do? Turf everybody out? In that case, you might have no police force.
And going back to your earlier point, the political consequences of that in terms of maintaining unionist support for the agreement would have been very challenging. So I can certainly see the logic of what Patton did. It's the same issue, as you've said yourself, around this balancing act, where this is what transitional states are faced with. How do we transition towards the rule of law, towards human rights compliance, keep political momentum, keep people on board who need constituencies, who need to be kept on board? My final question is linked to this, Kevin. On that point where we're in agreement that balances are being struck and pragmatic accommodations are being reached here, how do you measure success in police reform in transitional contexts?
That's sort of the $64 million question, really. And sort of the literature would sort of say that there's maybe three sort of broad ways that you would measure it, and that is how representative is the new police force of the society that it's policing? What are the levels of cooperation? So is the community cooperating with the police force? But likewise, is our police service, it shouldn't be a police force during transition, which it should be a police service. Is the police service being responsive to the needs of the community when the community bring it there? And then finally, one of them is how respective is the reformed police service of legitimate political dissent and human rights, balancing that against its sort of regulatory function of state security. And I think actually in the north of Ireland, still, however many years after Patton, even after Sinn Féin signed up to policing, I mean, I wouldn't, not to sound like a pessimist, but I'm not so sure we would give it a clean bill of health on any of those grounds.
Yeah, and I think there's an interest. This is my final point, and I'd be interested in your reflections on this. Is police officers themselves, how they mark who they're interacting with. Policing, in the policing literature, there's a big discussion on how police officers divide communities and divide individuals between the rough and the respectable, and often how police services benchmark whether or not they're working effectively is, respectable people get on fine with us. But I remember listening to former PSNI Chief Constable, who'd also been a senior police officer in the Met in London. And he was on this very point. He said, well, the way I benchmark my success is not in the nice bourgeois middle class areas of, but is what are the relationship between my officers in the Met and previously estranged communities in Brixton. And so how do we as a police service deliver to people of colour who historically we've had difficult relations with? So it'd be interesting your reflections finally perhaps on that issue, on the rough and the respectable, and how police in a transitional context judge whether or not they're doing what they're meant to be doing.
I think sort of the issue is that whenever we tend to look at police reform in transitional context, yes, there's a transitional context. We have to always recognise and acknowledge that there are problems with policing everywhere, and that some of those issues and dimensions to policing will be reflected, whether it's a conflicted society, post-conflict society, or what's often referred to as the liberal Western democracy. There's class dimensions to policing, there's racial dimensions to policing, there's gender dimensions to policing, and they're all relevant too. I mean, in terms of Ord's remarks, I mean, I don't know. Turkey's voting for Christmas, because I wouldn't think either during Hugh Ord's, tenure or since, that there's a particularly great relationship between the PSNI and the Rough, and that's not just in Republican areas. I remember it was actually about a year ago, if you remember, I was supposed to go to that workshop in the Basque Country on restorative justice, and then due to a huge timetable and boo-boo on my part, I couldn't go. But there was two former loyalist combatants there, and they were involved in restorative justice in loyalist areas, and still, I mean, they weren't exactly painting a rosy picture of the relationship. And I mean, that's shown as well in terms of some of the stuff that we've seen coming out of the flags protest and some of the stuff coming out of the parading issue. So, I mean, it's okay. The respectable anywhere will probably get on with the police. It's in both their interests to get on. But in terms of the Rough, I mean, would working class people in Taggers Bay have any greater graft for the police than working class people in the New Lodge? Probably not. And it's probably what I've sort of argued in an article actually in Critical Criminology about 2-3 years ago, was that this is a class-based commonality and a structural issue that's completely masked over by this sort of facade of ethno-nationalism. So both have a very dim view of policing on a class-based, basis.
No, I think you make a very good point on the class issue, and I think it's a good point to maybe round up this conversation, because I think we're running out of time here. But in that these issues around class are cut across issues, and that cut through the broader political and sectarian conflict in this jurisdiction. But they are, as you say, they affect any post-conflict or transitional society. So it sounds like we have some way to go on the policing issue. Kevin, thank you very much. You have been listening to LawPod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff here at Queen's University Belfast. I want to thank again Dr. Kevin Hearty, my guest today. Please follow us on Twitter at QUBLawPod. For more information, you can also visit our website, lawpod.org, and please have a look at the show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere else you can get your podcast. Thank you for listening, and I am Kieran McEvoy, and this was LawPod.